Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be focusing on the NL East and all the moves they made this offseason. We're going to go beyond just seeing who went where, and we're really going to dig deep into the strategy behind the trades. Our friends over at baseballmusings.com had these really fantastic articles where they break down each team's moves, and we're going to be pulling from those. By the end of this, you'll have all the knowledge you need to impress even the biggest baseball fan in your life.
Yeah, what's really fascinating to me is that this offseason we really saw teams going beyond just getting like the big names. We really see this focus on building well-rounded rosters and something that really stood out to me is how much emphasis teams are putting on on-base percentage.
That really jumped out at me too, that OBP focus. So let's start off with the Atlanta Braves. They had a kind of rough season last year, and their left field was definitely a weak spot for them. So they go out and get Jerickson Profar. He's projected to hit about .241, .325, .377, which is a pretty solid improvement over the group of left fielders they were running out there last year who hit .229, .278, .364.
Yeah, and those numbers don't really tell the whole story. I mean, think about the impact of Profar getting on base more often. It's not just about his individual stats. When you have fewer outs in left field, that means more opportunities for the heart of the Braves lineup to bring in those runs. You're giving guys like Olsen and Riley more chances to do damage.
Right. So even if Profar isn't like hitting a crazy high average, that ability to get on base can really boost the whole team's offense.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a good example of how teams are starting to really look at those on-base skills more closely. Now, the Braves also made a couple of other smaller acquisitions for left field. Nick Allen, who's really a defensive specialist, and then Brian De La Cruz, who's actually been having kind of a down year despite being in his prime.
Oh, yeah. I was curious about De La Cruz. Do you think this change of scenery could help him turn things around?
It's possible, yeah. Sometimes a new environment, new coaching can kind of re-spark a player's performance, but definitely something to keep an eye on. And then they also picked up Anderson Pilar in the Rule 5 draft. He's actually the only newcomer who doesn't have any MLB experience, so there's a little bit more risk involved with him.
Yeah, his minor league ERA was pretty good, though, 2.86. And the article mentioned that he was a three true outcomes kind of pitcher. I'm guessing that means strikeouts, walks, and home runs.
You got it. High strikeouts, but yeah, also a tendency to walk batters and give up the occasional long ball. It'll be interesting to see how the Braves handle him and, help him develop. If they can help him get that command under control, he could be a pretty valuable part of their bullpen.
For sure. So the Braves, it looks like they're shoring up some weaknesses, adding some depth. Let's head down to Miami now, where the Marlins are taking a bit of a different approach with their younger team. So they picked up Liam Hicks in the Rule 5, draft a catcher, and his profile is pretty interesting.
Yeah, Hicks is a good example of a specialist. He gets on base like crazy, but he has absolutely no power. The article even called him a one-dimensional player, but a very good dimension.
One-dimensional, but very good.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. Is there really a place for a player like that in today's game?
Oh, absolutely. Think about those late game situations where you really need to get a runner on base to set up a scoring opportunity. Hicks is going to excel in those scenarios. His high on base percentage can make a real difference in tight games.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's not always about the home runs. It's about getting on base, creating those opportunities for the guys coming up behind him. It's like a chess match almost.
Exactly. And the Marlins actually have another specialist in Eric Wagaman. He's all about power, but he also strikes out a lot. So again, a very specific role for him on this team.
So it sounds like the Marlins are all about that strategic depth, finding those players who can really excel in those specific situations. They also brought in Cal Quantrill. He's a starting pitcher, and funnily enough, at 30, he's actually one of the oldest players on this really young Marlins team.
Yeah, and his acquisition is interesting because the article actually suggests that moving to Miami might actually help his performance.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, Quantrill's home run rate has been going up the past couple of seasons, but Lone Depot Park in Miami is known to be less hitter-friendly than some other parks. So if he's giving up fewer home runs, that can do wonders for his confidence and his overall effectiveness.
So it's not even just about his pitching ability. It's about how his style fits with the Marlins home park. It makes you wonder if teams are factoring in those park factors more and more when they're picking up players.
Oh, it's definitely a factor, especially for pitchers. A fly ball pitcher might do amazing in a park that suppresses home runs, while a ground ball pitcher might benefit more from a park with a really fast infield.
Right. It's about putting those players in a position where they can really succeed.
Precisely. Now, the Marlins also brought in Ronnie Henriquez. He has experience as both a starter and a reliever, so that kind of versatility is valuable. They could use him as a swingman, filling in wherever they need him.
So the Marlins' versatility, strategic depth, That seems to be their focus. Now let's move on to the reigning NL East champs, the Philadelphia Phillies. They seem to be doing more tweaking than like major overhauls this offseason.
Yeah, well, coming off a division title, it makes sense that they're, refining that roster. One interesting move is that they're moving Max Kepler to left field. He's primarily been a center fielder, but his defensive metrics have been kind of slipping lately.
So they're thinking that maybe he'll be more comfortable and therefore more effective defensively out in left field?
That's the hope. Left field is generally considered a little less demanding than center, so it could be a good fit for Kepler at this point in his career.
Interesting. Well, it'll be interesting to see if that move pays off. Now, they also added a new fifth starter, Jesus Luzardo. He's coming off an injury-shortened season, though.
Yeah, Luzardo's a talented pitcher, but the big question is his health.
Hmm.
If he can stay healthy and give the Phillies like 140 innings or so, that would be a huge win for them.
Why 140 innings? What makes that number so important for a fifth starter?
Well, it's all about workload management. 140 innings from your fifth starter means that he's consistently taking his turn in the rotation. It gives the other starters adequate rest, and it prevents the bullpen from getting overworked.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about Luzardo's individual performance, it's how that impacts the whole pitching staff and keeps them fresh throughout the season.
Exactly. And speaking of injury comebacks, the Phillies also picked up Jordan Romano. He's a closer, and he's recovering from elbow surgery. He's a high strikeout pitcher with a low home run rate, which is fantastic for a closer. But, the big question is, can he get back to his pre-injury form?
Elbow surgeries can be tough for pitchers. That's definitely a high-risk, high-reward move for the Phillies.
It is. If Romano can regain his form, he's going to be a big asset to their bullpen. But if he struggles, that could create some uncertainty in those like late innings, high pressure situations.
Definitely adds another layer of intrigue to the Phillies bullpen. Before we move on to the Washington Nationals, let's talk about one more Phillies acquisition. Joe Ross, a swingman who has a pretty interesting track record.
Ah, yes, Joe Ross.
Yeah.
He's either keeping the ball in the park completely or he's giving up a ton of home runs. There doesn't seem to be much in between.
So which Joe Ross are we going to see in 2025? The home run suppressor or the home run derby pitcher? Guess we'll have to wait and see. But for now, let's shift our focus over to the Washington Nationals. They were surprisingly busy this offseason, especially when it comes to their bullpen.
Yeah, they made a ton of moves. It's kind of surprising because their relief pitching was decent last year. It's like they decided to completely shake things up and just see what happens.
Well, they definitely weren't afraid to make some changes. One of the notable moves they made was bringing in Nathaniel Lowe to play first base. His projected slash line is .269, .353, .31, .376.
And it's that improvement in on-base percentage that really jumps out at me. Remember what we were saying about the Braves and Profar? Fewer outs means more opportunities for the hitters behind him.
Right, so again, it's not just about Lowe's individual numbers. It's how his on-base skills can benefit that whole Nationals lineup. It's about setting the table for the power hitters.
Exactly, and you can see how teams are really starting to value on-base percentage as a key ingredient to offensive success.
The Nationals are definitely following that trend with Lowe's. They also brought in Paul DeJong as a backup infielder, who's known more for his defense than his hitting.
Yeah, DeJong's a classic defensive specialist. He's that guy you bring in late in a close game to make that crucial play in the field to protect a lead. His bat might not be a threat, but his glove can change the game.
So adding some depth, specializing the roster with moves like that, they also acquired Ahmed Rosario, who seems to rely heavily on his high batting average for offensive production.
Yeah, Rosario's an interesting case. Pretty much all his offensive value comes from his ability to just hit for average. He doesn't walk much, he doesn't hit for power, but he puts the ball in play and he gets on base a decent amount.
So another situational player, someone you might use in specific situations where you just absolutely need a hit. It's interesting how teams are building these rosters with such specialized roles in mind.
It really shows you how much emphasis is being put on strategy and maximizing every player's contribution to the team.
Absolutely. Now, one of the more intriguing acquisitions for the Nationals has to be Michael Soroka, their new fifth starter. He had this phenomenal 2019 season, but has been battling injuries ever since.
Soroka is kind of a wild card. He's still young, and if he can stay healthy and get back to his pre-injury form, he could be a steal for the Nationals.
But that's the big question. Can he stay healthy?
That's the million-dollar question. The good news is his fastball velocity actually hasn't been affected by the injuries. In fact, it's increased a bit. He's also been working on his slider, lowering the velocity to create more separation from his fastball.
Oh, so he's not just trying to get back to where he was. He's trying to improve and evolve as a pitcher. I like that.
It's definitely encouraging, but, even with the increased velocity and the slider adjustments, there's still that question of durability. Can he stay healthy for a whole season? Can he handle that starter workload?
That's the million-dollar question for the Nationals. If he can stay healthy and pitch effectively, it'll be huge for their rotation.
Yeah, it could be the difference between them being a fringe contender and a real threat in the NL East.
It's amazing how one player can have such a big impact.
It's one of the things that makes baseball so fun.
Yeah.
Every player can contribute in their own way, and sometimes it's those unexpected contributions that really make the difference.
It's a team sport, but there's also this very individual aspect to it. Each player has their own story, their own journey, and their own challenges to overcome.
And I think that's what makes it so relatable. We all face our own challenges in life, and I think we can see ourselves in these players who are striving for success, battling through adversity, trying to make their dreams a reality.
It's more than just a game. It's a reflection of life in a lot of ways.
Well said. And speaking of reflections, I think it's time to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. We've been talking about individual players and moves, but what does all this mean for the NL East as a whole?
That's a great question. We've seen a lot of different approaches this offseason, from the Braves focusing on their left field to the Marlins with that strategic depth, and then the Nationals completely overhauling their bullpen.
It's like each team is trying to find their own unique path to success. There's no one-size-fits-all approach in baseball.
And that's what makes it exciting. The NL East is shaping up to be this battle of different strategies, different philosophies, different ways of building a winning team.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how teams are changing up their bullpen strategies these days. The Nationals, they also brought in Evan Reifert through the Rule 5 draft, and then they signed Shinosuke Ogasawara from Japan. Neither one of those guys really fits that typical high strikeout reliever mold, but they've both shown they can keep the ball in the park.
That is really interesting. It makes you think, is that something inherent to the pitchers themselves, those home run suppression skills, or is it something that can be taught or, developed through coaching strategy?
That's a good question. And I think it kind of gets at this larger debate in baseball right now about the balance between raw talent and strategic development. Are some pitchers just naturally gifted at limiting home runs? Or can you teach a pitcher how to induce weaker contact and, keep the ball on the ground?
It's like that age-old nature versus nurture, but for baseball. I'd love to see some research on how much of home run suppression can be attributed to a pitcher's inherent skills versus their approach and the team's defensive strategy.
I bet there's some fascinating data out there on that. Maybe that's something for a future deep dive. But for now, let's go back to that idea of teams prioritizing on-base percentage. We saw it with the Braves and for the Nationals with Lowe's and even the Marlins with Hicks.
It does seem like there's this growing recognition that getting on base, however you do it, is crucial for success on offense. It's not just about hitting dingers anymore.
Exactly. And I think this shift in thinking is reflected in how teams are evaluating players, too. We're seeing a bigger emphasis on those advanced metrics like WOBA and WRC+.
I have heard those terms thrown around, but I have to admit I'm not 100% sure what they mean. Can you break those down for us?
Of course. So WOBA stands for weighted on-base average, and WRC+ is weighted runs created plus. They're basically just more sophisticated ways of measuring a player's offensive contribution, compared to those traditional stats like batting average and RBIs. They consider, the value of different types of hits, walks, and even getting hit by a pitch.
It's sort of like a single isn't as valuable as a double, and a walk is more valuable than a strikeout. It's about weighting those different outcomes based on how much they actually impact scoring runs.
Exactly. And WRC Plus takes it a step further by adjusting for park factors and league averages. So you get a more accurate picture of a player's offensive performance, relative to their peers.
It's amazing how much data and analysis goes into evaluating players these days. Makes you appreciate the complexity of the game.
Oh, it's a whole new ballgame when it comes to player evaluation. And I think this focus on these advanced metrics is driving that trend towards valuing on-base percentage. Teams are realizing that hitters who can consistently get on base, even if they aren't hitting a ton of home runs, can still have a huge impact on their team's run production.
It's a great example of how data is changing the way the game is played and how teams are being built.
It really is. And it's not just about offense either. We're also seeing this trend towards specialization in pitching, especially in the bullpen.
Right. Like we were just talking about the Nationals, building that bullpen with pitchers who have different strengths, not just those traditional strikeout pitchers. It's like they're building a toolbox with a specific tool for every situation.
That's a great analogy. And it's something we're seeing more and more teams embrace. Instead of relying on, two or three relievers to handle those late innings, they're building these deeper bullpens with pitchers who can excel in those really specific situations.
It makes you wonder if this trend towards specialization will eventually lead to even more defined roles in the bullpen. Like
Yeah.
maybe we'll see a dedicated ground ball pitcher or a weak contact specialist become standard on every team.
That's an interesting thought. And it would definitely lead to some really cool strategic decisions for managers. Imagine having to choose the right pitcher for every single situation based on the game situation, even the ballpark.
It'd be like chess, but with pitchers.
Exactly. And speaking of strategic decisions, let's talk about the Philadelphia Phillies. One move that really stuck out to me was their decision to bring in Jordan Romano as their closer, even though he's recovering from elbow surgery.
Yeah, that's a pretty high risk, high reward move. We were talking earlier about how tricky those elbow surgeries can be for
Oh,
pitchers.
absolutely. There's no guarantee that he'll be able to get back to his pre-injury form, but if he does, he'll give the Phillies this really dominant closer who can rack up those strikeouts and keep the ball in the park.
It makes you think about the pressure those closers face, especially in a division as competitive as the NL East. They're expected to come in and shut the door in these high pressure situations, often with the game on the line.
And those high-pressure situations can take their toll both physically and mentally. It's no
Mhm.
wonder that we're seeing more and more pitchers, especially those in those high-leverage roles, struggling with injuries.
It's a reminder that these guys are human beings, not just statistics on a spreadsheet. They have bodies that break down and minds that can be affected by pressure and fatigue.
That's a really good point. And I think it's something teams are becoming more aware of as they try to manage their players' workloads and keep them healthy throughout the season.
It's a balancing act for sure. You want to win games, but you also want to protect your players' health and their careers.
It's one of the many challenges that managers and front offices face in today's game.
Speaking of challenges, let's go back to the Washington Nationals and their fifth starter, Michael Soroka, another guy coming off a major injury. And there are a lot of question marks surrounding his ability to return to form.
Yeah, Soroka's case is really interesting because he was so dominant in 2019 before those injuries started. Looked like he was going to be a future ace. And the Nationals are hoping that he can recapture some of that magic.
The article mentioned that his fastball velocity is actually up since the injury, and that he's been messing around with his slider to try and create some more separation between his fastball and his off-speed stuff.
Yeah, those are definitely positive signs. It seems like he's not just trying to get back to where he was, he's actively trying to improve and evolve as a pitcher.
That kind of dedication is impressive. It makes you root for the guy.
Absolutely. But, even with the increased velocity and those slider adjustments, there's still that question of durability. Can he stay healthy for an entire season? Can he handle that workload as a starter?
That's the big question for the Nationals. If Soroka can stay healthy and pitch effectively, it could be a huge boost to their rotation.
Yeah, it could be the difference between them being a fringe contender and a legitimate threat in the NL East.
It's crazy how one player can have such a big impact on a team's fortune.
It's one of the things that makes baseball so fascinating. Every single player on that roster can contribute in their own way. And sometimes it's those unexpected contributions that make all the difference.
It's a team sport, but there's also this very individual aspect to it. Each player has their own story, their own journey, and their own challenges to overcome.
And that's what makes it so relatable, I think. We all face challenges in our own lives. And we can kind of see ourselves in these players who are striving for success, battling adversity, try and make their dreams a reality.
It's more than just a game. It's a reflection of life in a lot of ways.
Well said. And speaking of reflections, I think it's time to kind of take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. We've been talking about these individual players and specific moves, but what does it all mean for the NL East as a whole?
That's a great question. We've seen a lot of different approaches this offseason, from the Braves focusing on bolstering their left field to the Marlins and their emphasis on strategic depth, and then the Nationals just totally overhauling their bullpen.
It's like every team is trying to find their own path to success. There's no one-size-fits-all approach in baseball.
And that's what makes it so exciting. The NL East is shaping up to be this battle of different strategies, different philosophies, different ways of building a winning team. It really feels like we're going to see a clash of styles in the NL East this season. It's going to be so interesting to see which of these approaches ends up working best in this new era of baseball.
Yeah, and one of the most fascinating parts of all this for me is how it's going to affect in-game strategy. Managers are going to have so many more options now, more specialized tools in their toolbox, so to speak.
Like, they're playing a much more complicated game of chess. They have to be thinking several moves ahead,
Yeah.
you know, anticipating those situations and making sure they have the right guy for the job.
Exactly. And it's not just about, matching up hitters and pitchers anymore. You have to think about park factors, defensive strengths, and even a player's mental and physical state.
That's like a whole new level of strategy.
Yeah.
It'd be so interesting to see which managers can really adapt and do well in this new environment.
It's going to be a real test of their skills and their ability to think outside the box for sure.
Yeah.
And for fans, well, it means we're going to see more creative lineups, more strategic pitching changes, and honestly, just more exciting and unpredictable games.
I can't wait. But before we go, let's give our listeners some homework. What are some of the key things they should be looking for as the season goes on? What are some storylines or trends that might give us a clue as to which strategies are working?
Well, first and foremost, pay attention to those on-base percentages. We've talked about how a few teams like the Braves and the Nationals are really prioritizing those guys who can get on base, even if they're not hitting a ton of home runs. So will that actually lead to more runs and more wins?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, it could have implications for the whole league. If those OBP-focused teams start to find success, we might see a ripple effect across baseball with other teams trying to do the same thing.
Exactly. Another thing to watch is how managers are using their bullpens. Are we seeing them use relievers in more specialized roles? Are they making more of those strategic pitching changes based on matchups in game situations?
And are those decisions leading to, more shutdowns, more lazying comebacks, more dramatic finishes? The bullpens become such a crucial part of the game. And I think we're going to see some really interesting new approaches this year.
Absolutely. And last but not least, keep an eye out for those unexpected contributions. Those players who maybe weren't really on anyone's radar but end up playing a really important role in their team's success. Baseball's full of surprises.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's those unsung heroes who make all the difference.
It's a good reminder that this game's about more than just star power and big contracts. It's about teamwork, it's about strategy, and yeah, a little bit of luck too. And that's what makes it so fun to watch.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to all our listeners out there, get ready for a really exciting, unpredictable, and strategically fascinating season in the NL East. It's going to be a wild ride.
And we'll be here to break it all down for you every step of the way. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep loving the game.